Hello and welcome to the fourth in this series of training videos on measuring results in the public sector. I'm Mark Robinson and the videos are brought to you by the European Union. In the last three videos we have focused on outputs and outcomes. Now we turn our attention to another crucial element in the public sector results chain, and that's the concept of activities. So let's start with the definition. Activities are work processes. They're work processes which are part of or which support the production of outputs. Let's take an example from a hospital setting, the example of the treatment of a patient with severe blockage of the heart arteries. This is a condition that requires heart bypass surgery. Now, the output here is the entire treatment of the patient from the time they enter hospital to when they leave. The activities required to deliver that treatment, that output, include anesthesia, surgery, post-operative nursing care, the admission procedures when the patient arrives at the hospital, and many others. In addition to this, the support services which are part of the hospital are also activities which contribute to the delivery of this treatment of the patient. We're talking here about support services such as hospital cleaning, equipment maintenance, the hospital pharmacy service, as well as the accounting and human resources management services of the hospital. All of these support service activities are essential to the delivery of the treatments which are the outputs of the hospital. This hospital example helps us make the vital distinction between outputs and activities. An output is a service which is potentially capable of achieving its intended outcome. By contrast, an activity can't achieve the outcome unless it's combined with other activities. In the context of the treatment of our heart patient, clearly the patient isn't going to recover from anesthesia alone. In other words, if they're wheeled into the operating theatre, given an anaesthetic, and nothing else happens, that's not going to help them in any way whatsoever. Similarly, the surgery itself can't be carried out without all of the other supporting activities. It's only the total treatment combining all of these necessary activities which constitutes the output. It's worth discussing further the nature of support services. Any government ministry or agency is going to have a number of support services units. There'll be a policy and planning group, a legal services unit, a human resources management group, and a department or directorate that manages budgeting and accounting for the ministry or agencies. All of these groups provide important services which are essential to the operation of their ministry or agency, but they're not outputs. They're services which are delivered to internal clients, in other words, to other groups within the same ministry or agency, whereas outputs are defined as services which are delivered to external clients. Well, if that's what we mean by an activity, let's consider activity performance indicators by way of a few examples. The number of days of staff training delivered within the ministry is a good example of an activity performance indicator. Of course, staff training is important, but it's a service being delivered within the ministry rather than to external clients. In other words, it's a support service and cannot be an output. With respect to the human resources management function of the ministry, one useful indicator is the number of ministry job vacancies which it's filled during the year. With respect to policy development, a useful activity measure may be the number of consultations which are held with the public in the process of policy development. This is an activity because having a consultation with the public doesn't actually deliver them a service. It's not capable in itself of achieving any outcome. It's simply an activity which we carry out to help us develop better policy and deliver better outputs. Now, these three examples are all indicators of the quantity of activities carried out. Just as with output performance indicators, it's possible also to have quality and efficiency indicators for activities. The cost per job vacancy filled would, for example, be an activity efficiency indicator. Similarly, if you were to systematically survey ministries' senior management to find out how satisfied they are with the policy advice being offered to them by their staff, that would constitute an indicator of activity quality. Now, activity performance indicators are important, but they're important principally for internal management purposes. In other words, if you're the chief executive officer of a ministry, or if you're running one of the departments or divisions within that ministry, you need these sort of internal activity indicators to help you manage properly. By contrast, activity indicators are not the sort of indicators we want to use for external reporting purposes, because the public and the political leadership care about results. That means outcomes achieved and outputs delivered. The internal activities which are necessary to achieve these results are a matter which concerns internal ministry management rather than external parties. Unfortunately, it's been very common internationally for ministries to confuse activity indicators with output or outcome indicators. This is particularly common in the early days of developing performance, reporting, and management systems. Let me give you some real-world examples, starting off with indicators which ministries have proposed as output indicators, which have in fact been activity indicators. The first one, the indicator of the number of times the tax regime has been reviewed to limit the importation of used vehicles and parts. Reviewing a tax regime or any other piece of legislation is an activity, not an output, because reviewing the tax regime is not a service that's delivered to external clients or to the public. It's the enforcement of that tax regime to limit the importation of used vehicles and parts which constitutes an output. Similarly, the indicator of the number of urban councils with formal plans guiding social services provision, that can't be an output indicator because a plan is not a service delivered to the public. The services in this case which are delivered to the public are the social services themselves, and the plan is simply an activity carried out to improve the quality of social service provision. Similarly, it's not hard to find examples where ministries have proposed as so-called outcome indicators, indicators which really are measures of activities. An example is the indicator, the proportion of national and local governments with comprehensive annual health plans and budgets. Well, once again, developing a plan or elaborating a budget is an activity. It's not even an output, and it's certainly not an outcome, because as we've seen, outcomes are beneficial changes which are generated for individuals or for society as a whole. Well, that brings us to the end of this fourth session. Let me summarize the main points. The first concerns the concept of activities itself. Activities are work processes which are carried out in the delivery of services, that is outputs, to external clients. There's a big difference between outputs and activities, and that is that outputs are potentially capable of achieving their intended outcomes. This is not true of activities. For activities, it's only when they're combined with other activities that they produce the outputs which are then potentially capable of achieving their intended outcomes. Support services are always activities and never outputs. And that's because by definition, support services are services which are delivered to internal clients within the ministry or agencies, whereas outputs are services that are delivered to external clients. Activity performance indicators are very important for management purposes. However, their role is internal management within the ministry or agency. When it comes to reporting performance externally, what's important are output and outcome performance indicators.